Courtrooms are places where people are expected to tell the truth, present evidence, and accept responsibility for their actions. Then there are these defendants, who apparently thought that judges and juries would accept any explanation, no matter how ridiculous, as long as it was delivered with enough confidence. These are real excuses that people actually tried to use in actual courtrooms, proving that some individuals have never met an absurd story they wouldn't tell under oath. 1. A defendant charged with speeding told the judge that he wasn't actually driving fast, but that time was moving slower around his car due to a personal time dilation field he had developed through meditation. He explained that while his speedometer showed 85 mph, he was actually traveling at a safe 45 mph in normal time, and the police radar had failed to account for his temporal manipulation abilities. The defendant offered to demonstrate his time control powers in the courtroom, but the judge declined and imposed the full fine plus court costs for wasting everyone's time, which ironically couldn't be slowed down by meditation. 2. Facing charges for public intoxication. One defendant insisted that she wasn't drunk but was experiencing spiritual possession by the ghost of a drunk person who had died in a car accident near the bar. She claimed the spirit had taken control of her body and forced her to consume alcohol against her will, and that she should be considered a victim rather than a perpetrator. The defendant requested an exorcism instead of jail time and offered to provide contact information for her spiritual advisor who could verify her possession status. The judge was unimpressed by the supernatural defense and sentenced her to community service, presumably in a location with fewer restless spirits. 3. A shoplifting defendant argued that he hadn't stolen merchandise but was actually conducting a consumer research study on retail security systems for his college psychology class. He claimed that taking items without paying was part of legitimate academic research into store theft prevention methods, and that he planned to return everything after documenting security responses. The defendant produced what he claimed was a research proposal, though it was written on a napkin in crayon and included no actual academic methodology. The judge noted that legitimate research requires permission from study subjects and imposed fines that would definitely impact the defendant's academic budget. 4. Charged with driving without a license, one defendant explained that she didn't need traditional licensing because she was a sovereign citizen of the universe, whose driving abilities were governed by cosmic law rather than state regulations. She argued that traffic laws only applied to commercial drivers and that her personal transportation was protected under interplanetary travel rights. The defendant presented a handmade universal driving permit that she had created using glitter and star stickers as proof of her cosmic authorization. The judge was unmoved by the cosmic citizenship defense and ordered her to obtain a real license from the Earthly Department of Motor Vehicles. 5. A noise violation defendant claimed that the loud music wasn't coming from his property, but from a dimensional portal that had opened in his backyard and was transmitting sounds from an alternate reality where his neighbors were having a party. He insisted that he was as much a victim of the noise as his complaining neighbors and offered to show the court the exact location where the portal had appeared. The defendant explained that he had tried to close the dimensional rift, but lacked the proper interdimensional tools. The judge suggested that dimensional portals should be reported to appropriate authorities and imposed a fine that existed firmly in this reality. 6. Facing assault charges, one defendant argued that he hadn't actually hit anyone but had been shadow boxing with his inner demons when the victim accidentally walked into his therapeutic violence session. He claimed that the collision was entirely coincidental and that the victim should have recognized obvious signs of spiritual combat happening in the area. The defendant offered to demonstrate safe shadow boxing techniques to help the court understand how the victim had interfered with legitimate demon fighting. The judge declined the demonstration and noted that inner demons should be battled in private spaces where they wouldn't involve innocent bystanders. 7. A theft defendant insisted that she hadn't stolen the jewelry but had been temporarily borrowing it for a past life regression session, where she needed authentic period pieces to properly channel her previous incarnation as Egyptian royalty. She explained that the jewelry belonged to her in a previous life, and that modern ownership laws didn't account for reincarnation rights. The defendant offered to provide documentation from her past life therapist confirming her royal Egyptian heritage and historical jewelry ownership. The judge noted that past life property rights weren't recognized in current legal systems and ordered restitution based on present-day ownership laws. 8. Charged with breaking and entering, one defendant claimed he had been sleepwalking under the influence of alien mind control and had no memory of entering the property or taking anything. He argued that extraterrestrial beings had used advanced technology to override his conscious mind and force him to commit crimes while he slept. The defendant requested that the court contact NASA to verify recent UFO activity in the area that might support his alien manipulation defense. The judge suggested that alien mind control should be reported to appropriate federal agencies and imposed sentencing that would definitely keep the defendant awake during incarceration. 9. A traffic violation defendant explained that she hadn't been texting while driving, but was actually communicating telepathically with her cat, who was sick at home and needed her psychic support during a veterinary appointment. She claimed that her thumb movements on the phone were part of the telepathic transmission process and that she was providing essential emergency pet care through mental communication. The defendant offered to demonstrate her telepathic abilities by contacting her cat from the courtroom to verify her psychic pet care system. The judge recommended using traditional veterinary services and imposed fines that would require non-telepathic payment methods. 10. Facing vandalism charges, one defendant argued that he hadn't damaged the property but had been conducting an archaeological excavation to search for buried treasure that he was certain existed beneath the parking lot. He claimed that his digging was legitimate historical research and that any damage was necessary for important archaeological discoveries. The defendant produced a hand-drawn treasure map that he insisted was authentic historical documentation requiring immediate investigation. The judge noted that archaeological excavations require proper permits and professional supervision, and ordered restitution for property damage that had yielded no historical discoveries. 11. A public disturbance defendant claimed that she hadn't been causing trouble but was performing interpretive dance to express her constitutional rights, and that arresting her violated her freedom of artistic expression. She argued that her dance performance was protected political speech and that police had interrupted a legitimate cultural demonstration. The defendant offered to explain the constitutional significance of each dance movement and provide artistic interpretation of her choreographed protest. The judge acknowledged artistic expression rights while noting that constitutional interpretive dance should consider noise ordinances and public safety, imposing community service that might include less disruptive artistic venues. 12. Charged with trespassing, one defendant insisted he had been following a mystical energy trail that led him onto private property where he was searching for chakra alignment points that would restore his spiritual balance. He claimed that property boundaries didn't apply to spiritual seekers who were pursuing legitimate energy healing, and that he was providing a public service by locating positive energy sources. The defendant offered to map the spiritual energy patterns on the property to help the court understand his mystical trespassing justification. The judge suggested that spiritual energy could be pursued on public property and imposed fines that would definitely affect the defendant's chakra balance. 13. A defendant facing drug possession charges argued that the marijuana wasn't his but belonged to his spiritual guide, who was an invisible Native American warrior that followed him around providing life advice. He claimed that the drugs were part of traditional spiritual ceremonies, and that arresting him violated religious freedom protections. The defendant offered to introduce the court to his spiritual guide and explain the religious significance of his invisible advisor's drug possession. The judge noted that religious ceremonies require proper documentation, and that invisible spiritual guides couldn't be held legally responsible for drug possession by visible defendants. 14. Charged with disorderly conduct, one defendant claimed she had been practicing for the zombie apocalypse, and that her erratic behavior was legitimate survival training that everyone should appreciate as community preparedness. She argued that zombie preparation was a public service, and that her actions demonstrated important survival skills that might save lives during future undead emergencies. The defendant offered to provide zombie survival training to court staff and explain optimal apocalypse preparation strategies. The judge suggested that zombie preparedness should be conducted in appropriate training facilities rather than public spaces, and imposed community service that involved helping actual living people. 15. A reckless driving defendant explained that he hadn't been driving dangerously but was testing his vehicle's compatibility with magnetic field fluctuations caused by solar storms that were affecting automotive electronics. He claimed that erratic driving was necessary scientific research into electromagnetic interference, and that he was providing valuable data about space weather effects on transportation. The defendant offered to share his scientific findings with the court and explain how solar activity influenced his driving patterns. The judge recommended leaving electromagnetic research to qualified scientists and imposed license restrictions that would limit future space weather experiments. 16. Facing theft charges, one defendant argued that she hadn't stolen the merchandise but was liberating it from corporate oppression as part of a revolutionary movement to redistribute wealth and fight capitalist exploitation. She claimed that taking items from stores was legitimate political action and that she was a freedom fighter rather than a criminal. The defendant offered to explain her political philosophy and provide educational materials about economic justice and corporate responsibility. The judge noted that political movements should pursue legal channels for social change and ordered restitution that would support the capitalist system through fine payments. 17. A defendant charged with assault claimed he had been defending himself against psychic attacks from the victim who was using mental warfare to steal his thoughts and drain his life energy. He argued that physical self-defense was justified when facing supernatural aggression, and that the victim was actually the aggressor in a psychic battle. The defendant offered to demonstrate psychic self-defense techniques and explain how to recognize mental attack symptoms. The judge suggested that psychic conflicts should be resolved through mental health professionals rather than physical violence, and imposed counseling requirements along with assault penalties. 18. Charged with fraud, one defendant insisted that she hadn't committed fraud but was operating in a parallel economy where different rules applied and traditional monetary systems didn't govern her business transactions. She claimed that her financial activities were legitimate in alternative economic systems, and that conventional fraud laws were discriminatory against parallel economy participants. The defendant offered to explain parallel economic theory and provide examples of successful alternative monetary systems. The judge noted that all business activities must comply with existing economic laws regardless of theoretical alternatives, and imposed restitution using conventional currency. 19. A traffic defendant argued that speed limits didn't apply to him because he was driving in emergency mode to deliver urgent spiritual healing to a sick plant at his apartment that needed immediate energy therapy. He claimed that plant emergency services weren't available and that his high-speed driving was justified by the botanical crisis requiring immediate attention. The defendant offered to provide documentation of the plant's medical condition and explain emergency plant healing procedures. The judge suggested that plant emergencies could be addressed through normal driving speeds and botanical expertise, imposing fines that wouldn't help with plant therapy costs. 20. Facing property damage charges, one defendant claimed he hadn't damaged anything, but was conducting experiments in creative destruction as part of an art project exploring the relationship between chaos and beauty. He argued that his actions were legitimate artistic expression, and that property damage was necessary for important cultural creation. The defendant offered to exhibit his destruction art and explain the aesthetic philosophy behind creative property damage. The judge acknowledged artistic expression while noting that creative destruction required property owner consent, ordering restitution for art projects that hadn't been commissioned by property owners. 21. A defendant charged with disturbing the peace explained that she wasn't making noise but was communicating with urban wildlife using special vocal techniques that helped city animals cope with human environments. She claimed that her animal communication was environmental activism and that noise complaints interfered with important interspecies dialogue. The defendant offered to demonstrate proper urban wildlife communication and explain how her vocal techniques benefited local animal populations. The judge suggested that wildlife communication could be conducted at appropriate volumes and locations, imposing community service that might involve quieter environmental activities. 22. Charged with public intoxication, one defendant argued that he wasn't drunk but was experiencing temporal displacement sickness from accidentally traveling through time, and that alcohol-like symptoms were normal side effects of chronological travel. He claimed that time travel was legal and that temporal displacement symptoms shouldn't be criminalized. The defendant offered to explain time travel physics and provide documentation of his chronological journey. The judge noted that time travel didn't excuse public behavior and that temporal displacement should be reported to appropriate scientific authorities rather than resulting in public intoxication. 23. A theft defendant insisted she had been rescuing merchandise from negative energy contamination and that taking items from stores was actually providing a cleaning service that protected other customers from spiritual pollution. She claimed that her theft was environmental activism focused on energy purification, and that she deserved payment rather than prosecution. The defendant offered to provide energy cleaning services for the courthouse and explain how to identify contaminated merchandise. The judge suggested that energy cleaning should be performed by store employees and imposed restitution for unauthorized purification services. 24. Charged with trespassing, one defendant claimed he had been following ancient migration routes that existed before modern property boundaries, and that his ancestors had established permanent travel rights through the area. He argued that historical precedent gave him unlimited access to all property along traditional migration paths, regardless of current ownership. The defendant offered to provide historical documentation of ancestral migration patterns and explain traditional land use rights. The judge noted that modern property laws supersede historical migration patterns and that ancestral rights required proper legal documentation rather than personal claims. 25. A defendant facing assault charges argued that he hadn't attacked anyone but was performing emergency acupuncture on the victim, who appeared to have blocked energy meridians that required immediate treatment. He claimed that his actions were medical assistance and that the victim should be grateful for receiving free alternative healthcare rather than pressing charges. The defendant offered to provide acupuncture credentials and explain emergency energy meridian treatment procedures. The judge suggested that medical treatment required patient consent and proper licensing, imposing penalties for unauthorized healthcare delivery. 26. Charged with vandalism, one defendant explained that she hadn't damaged property but was creating crop circles for alien communication, and that her artistic ground patterns were important interplanetary diplomacy that could benefit all humanity. She claimed that alien communication was protected speech, and that vandalism charges interfered with cosmic diplomatic relations. The defendant offered to explain alien communication protocols and provide examples of successful extraterrestrial contact through artistic ground patterns. The judge recommended contacting appropriate space agencies for alien diplomacy and ordered restitution for unauthorized cosmic communication installations. 27. A traffic violation defendant claimed that he hadn't been speeding but was testing gravitational anomalies in the area that might affect vehicle velocity, and that his driving was legitimate scientific research into local physics variations. He argued that gravity research required variable speed testing and that traffic laws didn't account for scientific investigation of spatial anomalies. The defendant offered to share his gravitational research findings and explain how local physics variations affected driving safety. The judge suggested leaving physics research to qualified scientists and imposed penalties that would definitely be affected by normal gravitational forces. 28. Facing drug charges, one defendant insisted that the illegal substances weren't drugs but were herbal supplements for interdimensional travel that helped her visit parallel universes where she conducted important research for her doctoral dissertation. She claimed that interdimensional travel was legitimate academic research and that drug laws didn't apply to scholarly dimensional exploration. The defendant offered to provide academic documentation of her interdimensional research and explain proper parallel universe travel protocols. The judge noted that academic research required proper university oversight and that doctoral dissertations should be conducted in this dimension. 29. A defendant charged with disorderly conduct argued that she wasn't causing disturbances but was performing emergency feng shui to correct dangerous energy imbalances in public spaces that threatened community harmony. She claimed that her actions were public safety services and that disorderly conduct charges interfered with important environmental energy management. The defendant offered to provide feng shui credentials and explain how energy imbalances create public safety hazards requiring immediate correction. The judge suggested that feng shui services should be requested by property owners and imposed community service that involved more conventional public safety activities. 30. Charged with breaking and entering, one defendant claimed he had been responding to a psychic distress call from objects inside the building that were crying out for liberation from materialistic imprisonment. He argued that property rescue was humanitarian work and that breaking and entering laws didn't account for psychic emergency response. The defendant offered to demonstrate psychic communication with objects and explain how to recognize materialistic distress signals. The judge recommended focusing psychic abilities on legal activities and imposed sentencing that would limit future object liberation missions. 31. A theft defendant explained that she hadn't stolen anything, but was conducting a social experiment on human generosity to test whether people would notice missing items and how communities respond to property redistribution. She claimed that her theft was legitimate research into social behavior and that she planned to publish important findings about human nature and sharing. The defendant offered to share her experimental methodology and provide preliminary research results about community generosity patterns. The judge noted that social experiments required informed consent from participants and proper research protocols, ordering restitution for unauthorized generosity testing. 32. Charged with public nudity, one defendant argued that clothing was a tool of corporate oppression and that his nakedness was political protest against fashion industry exploitation of consumers. He claimed that nude protests were protected political speech and that public decency laws violated his constitutional rights to express anti-clothing political views. The defendant offered to explain the politics of clothing oppression and provide educational materials about fashion industry exploitation. The judge acknowledged political expression rights while noting that clothing protests should consider public decency standards and imposed community service that required appropriate clothing. 33. A traffic defendant claimed that stop signs didn't apply to her because she was driving in meditation mode, and that stopping would break her concentration and disrupt her spiritual practice. She argued that traffic laws should accommodate religious driving practices, and that meditation driving was protected spiritual activity. The defendant offered to demonstrate meditation driving techniques and explain how traffic stops interfere with spiritual transportation. The judge suggested that meditation could be practiced while stationary and imposed traffic penalties that would definitely disrupt future meditation driving sessions. 34. Facing assault charges, one defendant insisted that he hadn't attacked anyone, but was performing emergency exorcism on the victim who appeared to be possessed by demons that required immediate spiritual intervention. He claimed that exorcism was religious practice and that assault charges interfered with his constitutional right to provide spiritual health care. The defendant offered to provide exorcism credentials and explain how to recognize demonic possession symptoms requiring emergency intervention. The judge recommended leaving exorcism to qualified religious authorities and imposed penalties for unauthorized spiritual interventions. 35. A defendant charged with fraud argued that she hadn't committed fraud but was operating a reality-based crowdfunding platform where investors contributed money to support her lifestyle in exchange for exposure to authentic living experiences. She claimed that her business model was innovative entertainment and that traditional fraud laws didn't apply to experiential investment opportunities. The defendant offered to explain reality-based crowdfunding and provide testimonials from satisfied lifestyle investors. The judge noted that all investment platforms must comply with existing financial regulations regardless of innovation, imposing restitution for unauthorized lifestyle funding schemes. 36. Charged with trespassing, one defendant claimed he had been following butterfly migration patterns that led him onto private property where he was conducting important research into insect navigation systems. He argued that scientific research should take priority over property rights, and that butterfly studies benefited environmental conservation. The defendant offered to share his butterfly research findings and explain migration pattern documentation methods. The judge suggested that butterfly research could be conducted on public property with proper permits, imposing fines for unauthorized entomological investigations. 37. A noise violation defendant explained that loud sounds weren't coming from her property but were acoustic manifestations of her emotional aura that became audible when she experienced strong feelings. She claimed that aura sounds were involuntary spiritual phenomena and that noise ordinances discriminated against people with audible emotional energy. The defendant offered to demonstrate emotional aura sounds and explain how feelings create acoustic manifestations. The judge suggested that emotional auras should be managed through appropriate counseling and imposed noise penalties that would definitely affect the defendant's emotional energy balance. 38. Facing theft charges, one defendant argued that he hadn't stolen merchandise but was testing store security systems as a public service to help retailers identify vulnerabilities in their loss prevention programs. He claimed that his theft attempts were security consulting and that stores should pay him for identifying weaknesses rather than prosecuting him for professional testing. The defendant offered to provide security consulting credentials and explain proper vulnerability testing methodologies. The judge noted that security testing required authorization from store owners and imposed restitution for unauthorized loss prevention consulting. 39. A defendant charged with public disturbance claimed she wasn't causing problems, but was channeling ancient warrior spirits who were using her body to practice battle techniques that required vocal expression and physical movement. She argued that spiritual channeling was a religious practice and that disturbance charges interfered with her constitutional right to host historical spirits. The defendant offered to explain ancient warrior channeling and provide historical documentation of warrior spirit possession practices. The judge recommended channeling ancient spirits in private locations that wouldn't disturb modern communities, imposing community service for contemporary rather than historical activities. 40. Charged with drug possession, one defendant insisted that illegal substances weren't drugs but were molecular research materials for his home chemistry experiments exploring atomic structure and molecular bonding patterns. He claimed that chemistry research was educational activity and that drug laws didn't apply to legitimate scientific investigation of molecular properties. The defendant offered to explain his molecular research methodology and provide documentation of his atomic structure experiments. The judge suggested leaving molecular research to qualified chemists in proper laboratory facilities and imposed penalties for unauthorized home chemistry experiments. 41. A traffic violation defendant argued that traffic laws didn't apply during lunar eclipse driving conditions because astronomical events created special circumstances that altered normal transportation rules. She claimed that eclipse driving was affected by gravitational changes and that standard speed limits couldn't account for astronomical influence on vehicle operation. The defendant offered to provide astronomical documentation of eclipse effects on transportation and explain lunar gravitational impact on driving safety. The judge noted that traffic laws applied regardless of astronomical events and imposed penalties that would be unaffected by lunar cycles. 42. Facing vandalism charges, one defendant claimed he hadn't damaged property but was creating temporary art installations that would naturally decompose and leave no permanent impact on the environment. He argued that biodegradable vandalism was environmental art and that property damage laws discriminated against sustainable artistic expression. The defendant offered to explain biodegradable art techniques and provide examples of environmentally responsible temporary installations. The judge acknowledged artistic expression while noting that temporary art required property owner permission, ordering restitution for unauthorized sustainable art projects. 43. A defendant charged with assault explained that she hadn't attacked anyone but was conducting emergency chiropractic adjustment on the victim whose posture indicated serious spinal misalignment requiring immediate correction. She claimed that her actions were medical assistance and that the victim should appreciate receiving free health care rather than pressing assault charges. The defendant offered to provide chiropractic credentials and explain emergency spinal adjustment procedures for recognizing posture-related health emergencies. The judge suggested that medical treatment required patient consent and proper licensing, imposing penalties for unauthorized chiropractic interventions. 44. Charged with fraud, one defendant argued that he hadn't committed fraud but was operating a dream interpretation service where customers paid for professional analysis of their sleep experiences and subconscious symbolism. He claimed that dream interpretation was legitimate consulting and that fraud charges interfered with his constitutional right to provide psychological services. The defendant offered to interpret the judge's dreams and explain professional dream analysis methodologies. The judge noted that psychological services required proper licensing and training, imposing restitution for unauthorized dream consulting operations. 45. And finally, facing multiple charges including theft, assault, and public disturbance. One defendant provided the ultimate courtroom excuse by claiming that she was actually a method actress researching criminal behavior for an upcoming movie role, and that all her illegal activities were legitimate character development for professional acting work. She argued that method acting was protected artistic expression and that criminal charges interfered with her constitutional right to pursue acting career development through experiential character research. The defendant offered to provide acting credentials, explain method acting techniques, and screen test her criminal character development for the court. The judge noted that method acting didn't excuse actual criminal behavior, and that character research should be conducted through legal methods, imposing comprehensive sentencing that would provide the defendant with extensive real-world experience in the criminal justice system that could definitely inform future acting roles. Here's the truth about courtroom excuses. Judges have heard every possible explanation for human stupidity, and adding creativity to your excuse doesn't make it more believable. It just makes it more memorable. These defendants proved that when facing legal consequences, some people think the solution is more absurdity rather than more honesty, and that courtrooms are apparently the last place some individuals learn that reality has rules. The real crime here isn't just what these people did, it's that they thought these excuses would work on people who hear lies for a living. Subscribe for more proof that the justice system's biggest challenge isn't complex legal theory. It's keeping a straight face during testimony.